Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And hello, everybody, and welcome back. Here we are, once again, finishing up January of 2019. Cody, how's it going today, buddy?
Man, I'm doing really well. Ready to get into this. However, before we get into this, I'm not sure exactly when this is airing, but is the Super Bowl happening or already happened?
Today should be January the 30th, I believe.
Oh, so it's coming up.
Yeah, the Super Bowl's coming up. Do you know anybody that's going to be there?
Well, let me just go ahead and throw this out here. So we're recording this before, obviously.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go ahead and say that I believe the Rams.
Yep.
And I believe the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
And I believe the Kansas City Chiefs win a Super Bowl this year.
And so I said the same thing. I'm picking Rams and Chiefs, except I picked the Rams. And so we'll see. I mean, there are things that are just as important as this podcast.
Well, the reality is you're a universalist.
Yes.
So there really isn't a choice. So
that's right. Everybody wins.
But the question is, does love win?
Well, this is why, as a pastor in my young, fired up days, I saw religion and God much like a game. Somebody wins, somebody loses, and that's the way that goes. And so within this divine, universal divine, somewhere along the way, there's loss and losers. But yeah, we got that. So we'll find out as we get past that date how that goes. I don't have any skin in the game either way. I'm not a fan of any of the four that are in the picture as we record this.
Well, I'm a fan of all.
Hey, that's great. I love that, Cody.
Okay,
great
so
heart.
We have been in this conversation, what is salvation?
Mm-hmm.
Last week, we spent a little bit of time on the micro and the macro, and we talked about universalism.
Yes.
You had a couple thoughts that I think need to be addressed at the front end of this podcast. And then we need to jump into a different subject, which I want to talk about, which is this idea of justification by faith.
Mm.
Should probably get into what I grew up in a world called the Great Commission.
Yeah.
And really, what are we what are we doing now with all of this? Now, that said, you talked about, still on the subject of universalism, you made a point about almost apologetics and attempting to use your energy to disprove this.
Yes.
Can you tell our listeners what you said? Because it sparked a couple of other trails that I thought were worth traveling.
Yeah. So as we discuss this, one of the things that I get into over the years, anyone who is suggesting a universalism with regard to salvation, is immediately people are pressing you on the matter, pressing you for how could this be so, raising all kinds of objections, being very upset about it in most cases. And yet at the same time, if the questions are pointed the other direction, and that is that salvation is not universal. Think about that for a minute. If salvation is not universal, then immediately I would like to know from somebody, where is the rule book that shows very clearly who is saved and who is not saved? And what my prediction is that you would end up with 30 or 40,000 different opinions, all of which will equate to 30,000 or so denominations that we have today. And that's how you get denominations. You use a first covenant paradigm of doing to determine salvation. And when you do that, all you end up with is division, which, by the way, is what the first covenant produces. It's called death. Death is division, separation. So for those that are so vehemently against and opposed to universalism, my conversation is simply going to start with that, and I'm going to ask you, okay, then will you define for me who is saved and who is not saved?
Well, that clears it up.
Yeah.
Well, you know what's interesting? Well, first of all, we are people that believe in evolutionary spirituality. And so we know that everyone's on their journey and everyone's at different stages of consciousness. And one of the things that I have observed is as people grow, it's almost as if their perspective is expanded, and then they eventually get to that place where they realize how broad and how wide this is.
Yeah.
But that does take time. So if you're a listener and you're like, I'm just not quite there yet, or you're a listener and you're like, I want to believe, like you'd mentioned, like a lot of people are just like, I want to believe that's true, but I'm not quite there yet. Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's what growth is. Now, to push back a little bit on what you said, what's really fascinating is generally those that would talk to you about defending their stance against not being a universalist, they would say, well, yeah, there might be 30,000 different opinions, but there's only one absolute truth, and that's the Bible. And now here's what's interesting. They would treat the Bible as the authority. But here's the problem. Here's the dilemma that I faced is that sounds great in theory. The problem is the Bible doesn't say anything. We read it and we interpret it. And no one can get around that. We all have to interpret the text. Like, we don't have an option in that. And what's really interesting is like, well, I don't interpret it. I'm just telling what the Bible plainly says.
Right, exactly.
And what becomes the authority then and what becomes infallible is our interpretation.
Absolutely.
And that's when you make an idol and you put a veneer on it and you call it absolute truth.
Yeah.
And you leverage it to scare everyone into doing exactly what you say needs to be done and how you see the world.
Absolutely. And think about the first covenant world into which Jesus came. He was surrounded by teachers of the law, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and all their questions were of that nature, of the same nature that Christians are asking. They want to know, Jesus, is it lawful? Is it lawful? Is it correct? Is it this? Is it that? And that's what that covenant produced. That's why that covenant produced sin and death, is because it was all based on human interpretation of the law. Jesus, is it lawful to heal a man on the Sabbath? And on we go. And so that begat thousands of laws about what you could and couldn't do in every circumstance of your life. It brought about judgment. We use the term Pharisaical today because we know that as much as we are judging other people, we have plenty within our own lives that could also be judged. It just may be that our issues we have been able to cover, as Jesus said they often did, and other people's are more publicly known or whatever it may be. So you have two covenants that are going to produce two different ways of looking at the human image of God and the nature of God. And the people that are more oriented toward actually the first covenant are the people that are most upset about the sending to hell, judging, lost than anyone else. Now, we'll talk in a few minutes about, but doesn't the Bible have a lot to say in Jesus' parable about Judgment Day and sheep and goats? It absolutely does. Well, then how in the heck do you reconcile that with universalism? We'll get into that. That's why we're doing our thing. But again, if you are looking at the nature of this on your own, these podcasts are for reflection. And because I believe what I believe that wherever you are today, you also, listening to this, are the perfect essence of God, and that you're just like me. You're trying to figure out what that means and what your next best step should be in life. And so if that's the case, then there's an infinite number of things that I don't know and that you don't know. And there are some things that we progressed and matured in. So in my mind, I don't have a problem, even if you disagree with me, I have no problem with that. In terms of God identity, I don't have a problem with someone that's in a church, a synagogue, or anywhere else. I don't agree with everyone, but I do not use that as a way of separating people from their essence.
Okay. I'm not derailing, but I do want to, I have like a couple little bullet points.
Sure.
If sin and death, speaking of universalism still, if sin and death have been defeated, all right, and we currently live in that space, then we are no longer sinners.
Correct.
Are we sinless?
Yes. Yeah, and so that's a great question. This gets back to, yes.
People are going to need to process that.
Yeah.
So we're sinless.
Yes, I'm sinless. And I can say that because my wife is not here today.
Oh.
No, seriously, this goes back to the definition of sin and the definition of death. First of all, most of us have learned from the narrative that when the narrative talks about death, it's talking about separation from God and not just biological death. So we realize, first of all, that when we're talking about death as a God term or a relation to God term, that death means separation. Sin is also only applicable as a relation to God term, not just in the general sense of doing something right or doing something wrong. So we've talked about this before, Cody, raising the kids, and those of you out there that may have kids. When your child does something that's wrong, or they don't do what they're supposed to do, they get a timeout, they go to the room, or they have the screen taken away. You don't say to your child, "Oh my goodness, you have sinned, Tommy. Susie, you have sinned." What we say is that, no, I told you not to do that. And we speak of right and wrong, but we do not talk about it in terms of sin. And the reason that's so critically important is the same reason that death is so critically important in understanding it appropriately. The sin that entered into the world came through Adam, and we've talked about this in the previous podcasts. Sin in relation to God could only exist when there's a commandment involved. And the first covenant was a covenant based on commandments, and Moses and 10 commandments and all the commandments that followed. And sin was that which was measured if you kept or did not keep the commandments appropriately. That was sin. When you're moved into a second paradigm, you are no longer under a system of judgment where God is deciding moment by moment whether you have God identity or don't have God identity. Instead, you are moved into a paradigm, a space, a new heaven and earth where there is no more death. What does that mean? It means that I'm conscious of the fact that my identity is and always will be God identity. Does that mean that I'm precluded from making a bad choice? No, I can make a bad choice. Is it called sin? No, it's not called sin. I might say that I did something in resistance to my own essence or resistance to God, but that's a lot more than semantics to me. Because when you're talking about sin, Paul makes it clear in 1 Corinthians 15 that the wages of sin is death. So if I sin, then I also die. This is why Adam was told, in the day you eat of the fruit, or in the day you break the commandment, you shall surely die. Adam died the minute he broke the commandment. No, he was biologically alive, but he died. And that was because of sin. What was sin? He violated the commandment that had to do with his relationship to God and God identity. And so when we realize this, then I am coming into a world today where I don't talk to people in terms or raising kids. I don't call them sinners. And really, Cody, to me, my experience has been in church life previously that specifically sin is usually used in somebody's having problem with moral or ethical situations. I mean, yeah, you could get into sin as being, maybe committing a murder or something like that. When most people, when they talk about how sinful this world is, they're usually talking about something that's a moral or ethical a situation that's happening out there, and whether or not a person has said the magic confession of faith, done the baptism or whatever, so that their sin gets forgiven. And then, of course, there's all kinds of iterations of that. Well, that's up to a certain point, and then pretty soon God realizes you're sinning, that grace may abound, and so he's only going to forgive your sins up to this point, and then pretty soon you're going to need to repent or go forward to your church. And then there's, again, thousands and thousands of iterations of that.
I think it's really important to define sin and define these deaths like we've done, because there's so much confusion around it. I was even thinking about our collective, Vinings Lake. A couple years ago, we kind of went public with the fact that we affirm, and there's a lot of conversation to have about this, but we affirm there are LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And I remember a couple of folks would show up and they would use language. This is the language I grew up with all the time, but they would ask me if I consider something a sin, right? Mm-hmm. So they would say, do you believe homosexuality as a practice is a sin? They would even I know my LGBT brothers and sisters know all about this, but they would nuance it to the point where they would say a homosexual is not a sin, but the practice of it is a sin. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
They would nuance it down to, well, you may feel like you are this, but as long as you don't. And so then you have celibacy. And there's lots of people, they call that side B, but there's lots of people that still practice that because they believe that. My point is, people used to always ask if I would consider something a sin.
Sure.
And it was really interesting because there was always this debate where, well, can I consider something a sin and you not consider something a sin? And who gets to define what that is and what that isn't? And they would say, well, the Bible does. Like, okay, well, when it says do not murder, then let's talk about that for a minute. Mm-hmm. That's a violation, right, of a commandment. Mm-hmm. Well, then why do you support our military?
Yeah. And
what if someone breaks in your house with a gun and you need to defend your kids?
Yeah. Again, all those are judgments, aren't they? And suddenly I can't, my rule book gets thicker and thicker. One of the things I would say about the homosexuality is simply this, about practicing it. If I remember correctly, Jesus said, if you even think it in your heart, and he was talking about everyone. So even if you're a heterosexual, if you think any kind of immoral thought, you are equivalent to the homosexual who's practicing it, because Jesus is saying that's equivalent, that to think it is the same as to practice it. And so if we want, when Jesus made those statements, he wasn't announcing, hey, look, man, you guys have had the law. You think that was tough? Well, let me tell you, buddy, there's a new sheriff in town. You know how you couldn't used to commit adultery? Well, buddy, it's going to be even tougher now. You can't even think about it. And so this is the way we interpret it, right? and that makes so much sense to people.
They always use for like pornography and like at men's conferences.
Right.
Oh, and every man in there would walk away going, damn, I'm a sinner.
Yeah. When they could have just said, well, forget the pornography. How about the other women in your own church? I mean, we can take this to the point of the ridiculous. The fact of the matter is we all have egos, men and women both, and we all have certain weaknesses in our lives. The word sin, back to that as a technical word, sin and death are both defeated. So Paul is going to say the wages of sin is death. The only way there can be death is if there is first sin. Death cannot occur other than after sin. Adam sinned because it was in specific regard to the violation of a God-given commandment. And that was the paradigm that was set up and that was equivalent to this old covenant paradigm. So again, what we're doing is we're saying you have to understand the definition of sin And in that sense, sin and death both have to be defeated. You can't defeat one without defeating the other. And Paul further goes on to say, the wages of sin is death, and the strength of sin is the law, commandment, which it goes all the way back to Adam. You take away commandment, law, you take away sin, you take away sin, you take away death. This is why in a macro view of two covenants, when the one comes to an end, sin and death comes to an end, and we are no longer having God relationship through the keeping of law. Law is always going to be there for me personally in my life to conduct my affairs on this planet, to not murder, to not commit adultery, and all the other things that are there. But law no longer has the role and function of determining my God identity. I find out that my God identity is far beyond what I do. And you can't take that away.
Oh, Doug.
Yeah, and we haven't even got to justification by faith yet.
I don't think we're going to make it.
But
what if we just save that one?
That's fine.
But we still have a little bit more time.
That's cool.
So
I have no idea where we are.
We have about 6 minutes.
Oh, wow. I went that long. See,
No, it wasn't you. It was me.
Oh, good.
Yes.
That's good, because I thought it was me. I get started on this stuff, man, and like Danae will be like, man, you were really wound up today. And I was like, really? Because I get off on these subjects and don't realize how much I'm like a preacher in the old days.
Aren't you just encouraged that Danae listens?
Yes. Yeah. She and my mom, I mean, you got to have some audience.
That's our audience.
That's our audience. Exactly.
Oh,
you got to have that. Well, I'm hopeful, Cody, that people will continue to respond through email. And again, info@presence.tv, and send questions. I've had questions from people that have asked me. I had one specific guy who has been really going through a lot of anxiety when, through a sincere heart, he looks at all the passages that talks about those that are not of the Spirit. And there are things like lying and gossiping. Mm-hmm. And he's going, oh my goodness, no, I may not have committed these other things that people call, quote, major sins, but I do lie. I've had lying, or I've gossiped, or I've done that. This is somebody that unfortunately takes the word too seriously if you're under the old covenant.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, because like a lot of our conservative fundamentalist stages of consciousness would this is where they would just be like, this guy, what a liberal. And which, again, is a way to kind of put us all in a box. But do you ever use the word sin right now? I mean, is there ever a time and place? Is there ever a catastrophe that you would say, I don't know of another word to use than sin?
No, one of the things, so for example, I've said on the podcast many times, and Danae and I have even talked about it, that we talk over coffee and we discuss kids and everything else, but we never use the word sin. Not because we intentionally avoid it. It doesn't even occur to us. It doesn't even occur to me to use the word sin. What does occur to me is unconsciousness, or Eckhart Tolle, in his book New Earth, which I highly recommend to folks because I think he really outlines beautifully the same thing that Jesus was saying. And that is that Eckhart is saying when people do these kinds of things, it is actually a kind of insanity. Now, it's not the kind of insanity that will get you off in a court of law, because we have our own social rules for what you know that you were doing versus what you don't know. But Eckhart says, even though in a court of law, they say you knew good and well what you were doing, what Eckhart is saying is, no, actually on the deeper spiritual level, they forgive them, for they do not know. Did they know they were crucifying Jesus Christ? They knew good and well what they were doing. They were crucifying Jesus, and they had a point to it, and they wanted to do it. And yet Jesus says you don't know what you're doing. That's the deeper spiritual reality of all. So when I look at all these hellacious things that happen in this world, the pain, the suffering, I attribute that to a type of insanity and that comes with an unconsciousness. And I'm also aware that hurt people hurt people. So how far back should we be taking this judgment of ours? If someone is a child abuser because they themselves were abused, how far back do we take this judgment? Are we really taking into consideration that the real problem here is the insanity that we're passing on through these behaviors, and to really focus upon that and trying to have not just justice, but restorative justice, healing justice? It may or may not be possible. Someone may have to spend their entire life behind bars. But those are the kinds of decisions we make with regard to our human choices that are absolutely, positively wrong and that cause pain and suffering. But I do not call them sin because they do not have anything to do with my true God essence, breath, image, identity. They only have to do with my unconsciousness of that true identity.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, that's great.
Good. I'm so glad you think so, because since we're doing the podcast together, that's helpful.
It's funny. We got caught a little bit there because I was like, well, I want to move on to the next thing, but we would never have enough time for that. Okay. So here's what we'll do. Guess what? We'll record another.
Yeah, we'll just pick it up next week. Yeah. Like we can bring up the justification by faith that you wanted to talk about early in the podcast.
Let's do that. And then we can do the Great Commission. And then I would also say for all of you that are listening, send us an email. Let us know. We want to hear from you. And honestly, even like as you look towards this year, 2019, if there are subjects or there are specific things that you want us to talk about, let us know. Send us an email. Just say, hey, have you considered these ideas for a series podcast? We would love to hear from you on that. And you guys get the opportunity to direct even these conversations. So you can reach out to us, just presence.tv. Speaking of that, before we get off of here, we hadn't said anything about this. Yeah. It's a new year, so it's time for a new look and a new start. And we just launched, by the time this lands, it'd been out for a little while. But if you didn't know, we launched a new website, presence.tv.
Yeah, New version. Love it. Well,
first of all, big thanks to our friend Matt Thompson. Who does a lot of the operations and graphics and everything behind. Mm-hmm. He's like the behind the scenes guy for Presence.
Yes, he is, and does a fantastic job of producing things for us, and the website as well. Real expertise in social media and other things. So we really appreciate him, and I really appreciate your input, because a lot of the things that are in this new website, you've brought fresh eyes to Presence. You've brought fresh ideas. You've modernized the things that we're doing. And I really love the look of it, Cody. I think it's exactly what we needed to do.
Well, I appreciate it. And hopefully it's really helpful for the people. We've made it as user-friendly as we can on your phone and on laptops as well. But we went into and redefined our about, because there was always a bit of ambiguity, like, well, what is Presence and who is Presence and what does Presence do? And we tried to make it as clear as we can. And another bonus is just there's a section on there on integral theology, which is what we are about. And so hopefully that'll be really helpful. And all of our resources and podcasts and all that good stuff. And we'll continue to add to it as we go. So anyways, there's all that information. Hope you guys have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.